All right, so we did a little bit of this, but let's do a recap of the spinal cord. So we're going to look at both the spinal cord and the brain in this lecture. So our objectives for 11.4 are to describe the structure of the spinal cord and its major functions. And then we're going to look at how to describe a reflex arc and reflex arc behavior. So basically what we know about the spinal cord is that it is that nerve column that passes downward from the brain into the vertebral canal, and it is part of the central nervous system. The spinal cord, the spinal nerves extend to and from the spinal cord and are part of that peripheral nervous system. The structure of the spinal cord longitudinally, its length is about 17 inches. It starts at the foramen magnum and it ends where it tapers to a point called the conus medullaris, and it terminates near the intervertebral discs that separate the first and second lumbar vertebrae. Overall, it contains 31 segments and therefore will give rise to about 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And you should note that there are cervical and lumbar enlargements. The cauda equina is that horsetail in which the lower lumbar and sacral nerves travel downward, and that is the spinal nerves must chase their points of exit. And then the filum terminale, that represents the distal portion of the tail, which would be the pia mater. So looking at the structure of the spinal cord, this is the cross-sectional structure. You see the gray matter or butterfly, that is bundles of interneuron cell bodies, posterior dorsal horns, lateral horns, and anterior ventral horns. So here you can see the gray matter. Here would be the lateral horn, anterior horn, posterior horn. And this is the gray commissure right in here. And there would be your central canal. So the central canal, that central canal here is lined with ependymal cells. You also have the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus. So here's your posterior median sulcus, and then here's your anterior median fissure. The structure of the spinal cord cross-sectional, you also have white matter. White matter is the myelinated interneuron axons. As far as location, posterior dorsal, you have the funiculi or white columns. Little pointer there. So you have the posterior funiculi. You also have lateral funiculi or white columns and anterior ventral funiculi or white columns. So here are the lateral funiculi. Here's the posterior funiculus. And then here would be your anterior funiculus. You have a ventral and dorsal root. So here's the dorsal root of spine nerve. And the dorsal root ganglion, which is right here. The dorsal root ganglion, remember a ganglion is a bundle of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So therefore it's in the peripheral nervous system. And the dorsal root ganglion contains the cell bodies of sensory afferent neurons that are going to bring impulses into the spinal cord or the central nervous system. The fusion of the dorsal and ventral root designates the beginning of the spinal nerve, which then passes through its intervertebral foramen. Functions of the spinal cord. The functions of the spinal cord are twofold. The spinal cord provides spinal reflexes and serves as a conduit for nerve impulses to and from the brain. So let's look at first spinal reflexes. Spinal reflexes are basically, they occur in gray matter of the spinal cord, and recall that a nerve pathway is the route traveled by the nerve impulse through the nervous system. So if you look here, reflexes are automatic, subconscious responses to stimuli within or outside the body. So you have a simple reflex arc, which would be sensory motor, and then most common reflex arcs are the sensory association motor. So here you have that receptor, and then you have that sensory or afferent neuron taking that information to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system is going to use that motor or efferent neuron to have an effect on the effector, which is a muscle or a gland. A reflex arc in general, it is the simplest demonstration of a nerve pathway. It involves 2 or 3 neurons. So you could have 2 or 3 neurons playing a role in here. It's an involuntary response, and it does not involve the brain. So here are some examples. The first example would be of a reflex behavior would be a knee jerk or a patellar reflex. It is the simple monosynaptic reflex, and it helps maintain upright posture. Another type is withdrawal, and that's flexor reflex, and it prevents or limits tissue damage. So an example of this, withdraw, here you can see a person walking, and there's a thumbtack down here, and if that thumbtack were on the floor, you'd feel that, and immediately you withdraw from stepping further onto that thumbtack. So that's a withdrawal reflex, or called a flexor reflex. An example also includes crossed extensor reflex, which is crossing of sensory impulses within the reflex center to produce an opposite effect. So there you have stimulation and inhibition. And that would then again go with looking at stepping on that thumbtack. Other types of reflex arcs include sneezing and blinking. So here's a table of parts of the reflex arc. You can see the receptor end of a dendrite or specialized receptor cell and a sensory organ, and that is sensitive to a specific type of internal or external change. And then you have the sensory neuron, which is a dendrite or cell body and axon of a sensory neuron. And basically its function is going to conduct an impulse from the receptor into the brain or the spinal cord. And we'll look at these as we go through. So basically what you have there, if you look at the parts of the reflex arc, you have that sensory receptor, which is going to react to a stimulus, and then that's going to cause a sensory neuron is going to conduct the afferent or sensory impulse to that central nervous system. And then the integration center is going to consist of 1 to several synapses in the central nervous system. From there, a motor neuron that conducts the efferent motor impulse, or the efferent impulse, which is the motor impulse, and that's going to come from the central nervous system to the effector. And remember that the effector is a muscle fiber or gland that is going to respond to that motor impulse by contracting a muscle. So if we look at all this, here you can see that all that information in this chart. Remember that uses of reflexes is to ensure proper transmission of an impulse from a sensory receptor through the nervous system to the effector to prevent tissue damage. Tracts of the spinal cord. Now we're going to look at continuation with functions of the spinal cord. You're going to look at nerve impulses. And basically the conduit for nerve impulse to and from the brain are these nerve tracts. So you could have two types. You could have ascending and descending tracts. Basically, the white matter of the spinal cord represents the location of our major nerve pathways called nerve tracts. And these are going to provide a two-way system of communication. In general, the ascending tracts are located in the posterior dorsal columns and are going to conduct sensory or afferent impulses from body parts up to the brain. So remember, afferent impulses are bringing things into the central nervous system from the peripheral nervous system. And then it will be processed there, and then the information in general will be carried by descending tracts, which are located in the anterior or ventral columns, and they're going to conduct the motor impulses, which are the efferent impulses. So to get grasp of efferent or afferent, think of efferent is exiting. So you have EE, efferent exiting impulses. So they're going to exit the central nervous system and go out to the peripheral nervous system. So the efferent impulses come from the brain down to effectors. The general characteristics of nerve tracts, basically most of them do cross over. Most of them consist of 2 or 3 successive neurons, and most exhibit somatotrophy, and that is the tracts from and to the upper body are located on outside, tracks from and to the lower body on the inside. And all pathways are going to be paired from left to right. So let's take a look first at ascending tracts. Basically, ascending tracts, you have the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. So here you can see fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. And the location of these tracts are in the posterior column. So if you look, you can see the posterior column here. And basically, the information that these two are going to carry are information related to touch, pressure, and movement. And then you have the spinal thalamic tracts, and they are located lateral tract in the lateral column, and the anterior tract is going to be located in the anterior column. And the spinal thalamic tract, as far as the lateral tract, the information carried there will be pain and temperature, and the anterior tract is going to carry information related to touch and pressure. And then you have the spinal cerebral tracts, and the spinal cerebral tract, its location anteriorly, it's located in the anterior superficial lateral column, and posteriorly, it's located in the superficial lateral column. And the information carried there is going to be sensation of movement of the lower limbs. So the spinal cerebellar tracts, posterior and anteriorly. Then you also have the descending tracts, and the descending tracts are the conduit for nerve impulses to and from the brain. So these nerve tracts, there are 3 of them. You have the corticospinal tract and its location. The anterior tract is in the anterior column. The lateral tract is in the lateral column. And the information carried by that particular pathway is control of our skeletal muscles. Then you have the reticulospinal tract, and the reticulospinal tract, it's as far as location, the anterior tract is in the anterior column. The lateral tract is in the lateral column, and the information carried by the reticulospinal tracts is going to be control of muscle tone and our sweat glands. And then you have the rubrospinal tract, and its location is in the lateral deep column, and the information carried is going to be control of posture. So looking at some of these, you could think of, as far as clinical application, you could think of ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. You could also look at hemilesions of the spinal cord and other spinal cord injuries. So we'll take a look at some of those in class. And then here you can see a summary of all those nerve tracks of the spinal cord. So if you missed some of that information, you could check it out here in the table. So compare what you wrote down with what I was just going over. So there you can see the ascending tracks, descending tracks, their location, and their function. Okay, the brain, 11.5, our last section for this lecture. The objectives is to describe the development of the major parts of the brain and explain the functions of each part. Distinguish among sensory, association, and motor areas of the cerebral cortex. Then to discuss the hemisphere dominance, explain memory and storage, and then lastly, explain the functions of the limbic system and the reticular formation. So looking at the brain itself, we know that the brain is the largest and most complex portion of the nervous system. It occupies the cranial cavity and is composed of 100 billion multipolar neurons. The brain oversees the function of the entire body and also creates characteristics like personality. The brain is composed of 4 major portions, which are going to include the cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, and the brainstem. So before we actually start breaking down the brain parts, let's look at brain development. So brain development, basically, let me scroll out there a little bit so you can see this. As far as brain development, the brain is composed of those 4 major portions, and its development is going to come from that neural tube. And what happens is in the embryonic neural tube, it's going to expand and hollows cranially. And that is eventually going to lead to 3 primary vesicles. So that neural tube is going to expand and form cranially, and it's going to hollow out what you would call the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The forebrain is going to basically develop into the cerebrum, the basal nuclei, and the diencephalon of the adult brain. The midbrain will develop into the midbrain, and then the hindbrain is going to develop into the adult brain's pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum. So here you can see brain development, the structural of the brain development. Basically, there you have the forebrain, anterior portion, posterior portion, midbrain, and hindbrain. And here you can see the regions of the brain that are produced embryonically from these vesicles. Structure of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain, which is divided into 2 cerebral hemispheres. The hemispheres are connected by a deep ridge of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. Surface ridges are called convolutions or gyri. So those are ridges or convolutions in the brain. And then each hemisphere is divided into lobes, which are named for the bones that cover them. And they include the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. And here you can see them colored. So your frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. The convolutions are separated by 2 types of grooves. You have sulci, these are shallow grooves in the surface, and basically you have 2 of them. You have the central sulcus, which is the frontal and parietal, and then you have the lateral sulcus, which is the temporal / others. And then you also have fissure, and a fissure is a deep groove in the surface. Longitudinal separates the cerebral hemispheres, and then transverse separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. As far as So here you can see the lobes again. The composition of the cerebrum. The bulk of the cerebrum is white matter. And remember that white matter is bundles of myelinated nerve fibers carrying impulses from cortex towards spinal cord by those oligodendrocytes. And you also have the cerebral cortex or other portions of that cerebrum where it is composed of gray matter, which are the bundles of those interneuron cell bodies. All right, functions of the cerebrum. Basically, functions of the cerebrum, interpreting impulses, initiating voluntary movements. It's going to store information as memory. It's going to retrieve stored information. It's going to play a role in reasoning. And it's a seat of intelligence and personality. So this is where our personality is coming from. So the cerebral cortex is responsible for all the conscious behavior by containing three types of functional areas, which include sensory, association areas, and motor areas. So the functional regions of the cerebral cortex, basically the cerebral cortex is a thin layer of gray matter that constitutes the outermost portion of the cerebrum, and it contains 75% of all those neurons in the nervous system. So let's look at those areas. So as far as sensory areas, here they are. Basically, what are sensory areas? Sensory areas are concerned with conscious awareness, and that conscious awareness is of sensations, and they are located in the parietal, occipital, and temporal cortex. So here you can see where some of these sensory areas are located. So they're highlighted for you as we go through. So you have the primary somatosensory cortex, and the primary somatosensory cortex is going to receive information from general receptors, and that would be temperature, touch, pressure, and pain. And it is located post-central gyrus of the parietal cortex. Then you have the visual area, or the visual cortex, and that is going to receive incoming information from photoreceptors in the retina of the eye, and that's going to be located in the occipital cortex. Then you have the auditory area. The auditory area is going to receive incoming information from hearing receptors in the ear, and that is located in the temporal cortex. And then lastly, you have the gustatory cortex, and the gustatory cortex is going to receive incoming information from the taste receptors and taste buds of the tongue. And basically that is located in the parietal cortex just above the temporal lobe. Here's another diagram of those sensory areas. So you could see further picture there as far as motor areas and sensory areas. Association areas of the cerebral cortex. Generally, these include areas that are not directly involved in motor or sensory function. They are involved in many traits, are usually interconnected, and involve all four lobes of the brain. Association traits include analyzing and interpreting sensory experiences, and they also help provide memory, reasoning, verbalizing, judgment, and emotions. So if you look at the sensory areas, here they are, or association areas. You have the frontal lobe association areas. That's as far as concentrating, planning, and complex problem solving. So that would be the function. That would be the frontal cortex. Then you have the parietal lobe association areas, and that is where you have understanding speech and choosing words to express thought. A speech pathologist might look further into problems with the parietal lobe. In the temporal lobe, this is the area where you're going to interpret complex sensory experiences. You're going to store memories of visual scenes, music, and complex patterns. And then in the occipital lobe association areas, you have the ability to analyze and combine visual images with other sensory experiences. Often in teenagers, your frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. It's still rewiring. So your temporal lobe, which is where your amygdala and the limbic system are found, they are fully developed. So you tend to have the typical adolescent behaviors seen among teenagers is because that temporal lobe is fully developed, while the frontal lobe, which plays a role in problem solving, reasoning, concentration, basically gets you to think logically. Since that's still developing, you tend to not be able to do those things as well as an adult would. So that's why sometimes teenagers make unwise choices in life. The last part would be the motor areas, and the motor areas of the cortex of the cerebrum. These are located in the frontal cortex. And you have the primary motor area, which initiates all voluntary muscle movements, and it's located in the gyrus just anterior to the central sulcus, or the precentral gyrus. You have Broca's area, and that is the area for motor speech area, and it's located in the frontal lobe above the temporal lobe. And then you have the frontal eye field, which is above Broca's area, and that's control the voluntary movements of the eyes and the eyelids. So those are some of the motor areas of the cerebrum. And here's another picture of the motor areas, along with some of the sensory areas as well. Here are further functions of the cerebral lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. All right, hemisphere dominance. Hemisphere dominance is also known as brain lateralization. And basically, when you talk about hemisphere dominance, the most basic functions, which are sensory and motor, are equally controlled by both the left and the right hemispheres. Remember that communication exists through the corpus callosum. So what's going to happen here, for some association functions, one hemisphere has greater control over language-related activities, which include speech, writing, reading, mathematics, and logic. That hemisphere of the brain that has major control over these functions is going to be known as your dominant hemisphere. In most people, it is going to be the left hemisphere of the brain that is going to be the dominant hemisphere. Then that would make the other hemisphere the non-dominant hemisphere. And that non-dominant hemisphere, that is going to be the hemisphere that controls orientation in space, art, musical appreciation, and emotions. So it also provides that intuitive thought process. So this is basically hemisphere dominance or brain lateralization. So left brain, right brain. Memory. As far as memory is the consequence of learning, whereas learning is an acquisition of new knowledge. Memory is the persistence of that learning with the ability to access it at a later time. And there are two types of memory. You have both short-term and long-term memory. Short-term memory is your working memory. So basically, what happens there, this is what allows you to function closed neuronal circuits, and the circuit is stimulated over and over. When the impulse flow ceases, memory does not. Memory does also, unless it enters that long-term memory via memory consolidation. And long-term memory changes the structure and function of neurons. And here's where we see a lot of new brain development coming about in recent years in neurobiology, where we could see that we used to think back in the day, especially when I was in high school, that at a certain age your brain was done developing. But today neurobiology has gone a long way, and it suggests that no, up until about age 25, your brain is still rewiring. It's connecting itself. And then even after that, as learning takes place, you still do some of that throughout your life. That's why it's important to keep reading, keep your brain active. Keeping your brain active is just as important as keeping the other parts of your body active, and it could actually reduce things such as Alzheimer's disease because you're changing the structure and the function of the neurons, and you're going to enhance those synaptic transmissions. And we talked about synaptic transmissions in the latter chapter. The basal nuclei, also known as the basal ganglia, these are the masses of gray matter located deep within the white matter of the cerebral hemispheres. They serve as relay stations for outgoing motor impulses from the brain. That is, the information, those outgoing motor impulses, are basically going to come from the primary motor cortex and the frontal cortex, and it's going to go to the basal ganglia and then through the brainstem down the spinal cord. Basically, here's where we get that release of dopamine, which is going to inhibit excess movements. We could see a relationship here with the basal nuclei to as far as applying what we know about the basal nuclei to Parkinson's disease. So it's primarily inhibited motor functions. The diencephalon, basically it includes two important gray areas or two important areas of gray matter. And here's where we see the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is going to be our central relay station for incoming sensory impulses, with the exception of smell. And it's going to direct sensory impulse to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex for that interpretation. And then the major role of the hypothalamus is the main visceral control center for the entire body. It's very important. It's very important as far as regulating homeostasis. So when we look at the hypothalamus and regulating homeostasis, it's going to control things like heart rate, arterial blood pressure, body temperature, water and electrolyte balance. It's going to control of hunger and body weight. It's going to control the digestive movements and secretions. It's going to regulate our sleep and wake cycles. And it's going to be the control center for our endocrine system's functions. And here you can see the thalamus and the hypothalamus. In the diencephalon, you also have the limbic system. The limbic system is involved in emotional response. So the limbic system consists of portions of the frontal lobe and portions of the temporal lobe. So it includes the basal nuclei and the deep nuclei as well. It controls emotional experience and expression. So often what we see here, the limbic system we often refer to as our pleasure pain center. Well developed in teenagers, and the prefrontal cortex is not. So here's where you get that unusual behavior and that sense of emotion. And teenagers tend to be very expressive, and the world centralized around them, and they can be very emotional. So this is all because of that well-developed limbic system in the temporal and some of the frontal lobe, and that frontal lobe, which is dealing with that reasoning and thought and logic, isn't quite there yet. So it's going to control that emotional experience and expression, and it can modify the way a person acts. It's going to produce the feelings of fear, anger, pleasure, and sorrow. It recognizes life-threatening upsets in a person's physical or psychological condition and counters them. and it's involved with the sense of smell. All right, our next venture will be into the brain stem, and basically the brain stem is composed of three major parts that include the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The brain stem serves as a pathway for fiber tracts running to sensory impulses and from, those are motor impulses, the cerebrum, and is the site where many cranial nerves from the peripheral nervous system are going to arise. The midbrain, it's located between the diencephalon and the pons. Here we have the corpora quadramina, and I think that's pronounced incorrectly. I have to look that one up. The corpora quadramina, I can't even pronounce that. I'll have to look that one up. That is going to be the formed dome-like protrusions on the dorsal midbrain surface. Here we also have gray matter within white matter, and it acts in reflex action, so visual and auditory reflex action. It also contains areas associated with reticular formation. Next area would be the pons. The pons is the bulging portion of the brain stem. It is going to be the bridge or pathway of conduction tracts. And it's the location of the pontine respiratory group, formerly called the pneumotaxic area, which is going to regulate breathing rate. So therefore, it will be part of the respiratory center. It also contains areas associated with reticular formation. And then as far as the brainstem, the last would be the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata is the inferior portion of brainstem, which blends into the spinal cord at its base. It's going to contain the autonomic reflex center involved in maintaining homeostasis of important visceral organs. So here we have the cardiac center, which is just the force and rate of heart contractions. You have the vasomotor center, which is going to regulate blood pressure, BP, by acting on smooth muscle in the walls of the peripheral arterioles, that is vasoconstriction. And vasoconstriction is going to have blood pressure increase, and vasodilation will have blood pressure decrease. You also have the respiratory system, which is going to control the depth and the rhythm of breathing. And then the additional centers in the medulla oblongata are going to regulate involuntary activities such as vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. Reticular formation. Reticular formation is basically in the brain, it controls brain alertness. At its lowest activity while sleeping, and it is inhibited by alcohol, tranquilizers, etc. Types of sleep. You have slow wave and rapid eye movement, which is known as REM sleep. Slow wave sleep is at about 90 minutes. It overall decrease occurs in reticular formation activity. And then you have your REM stage of sleep, which is during the rapid eye movement. And then certain areas of the brain are active. So this is the type of sleep that is responsible for dreaming. It lasts about 15 minutes, and it's going to alternate with slow wave sleep. The next portion of the brain would be the cerebellum. The cerebellum, it's the large cauliflower-like structure located dorsally to the pons and medulla and inferiorly to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. And it's going to be separated by the transverse fissure. Note in the diagram there, you have white matter within gray matter, and that would be arbor vitae. So we call that the tree of life in Latin. So you have white matter within gray matter. And the cerebellum is going to coordinate all voluntary muscle movements subconsciously, skilled movements, posture, and equilibrium. And equilibrium here is as related to balance, so how we balance. So here is a chart outlining the major parts of the brain. You have the cerebrum, the basal nuclei, the diencephalon, then you have the brain stem and its three sections, the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. There you can see the characteristics and location, and then there you have the general functions. So this is a summary table of what we've just gone through in the lecture. So that's it for today on the brain and the spinal cord. Our next lecture will include the peripheral nervous system, which will be section 11.6. And we'll also look at 11.7, which would be the autonomic nervous system. And then that should take us to the end of chapter 11. And then we'll have our last chapter of the nervous system. Have a good day.